Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the final video of first semester for AP Government.
Woohoo!
Feels good. We're going to finish up Judicial Branch. We're going to cover 15.4 to 15.7. Let's get to it.
Yeah.
15.4.
Jump right in.
Describe the background of judges and justices and assess the impact of background on their decisions. Let's do it. No vocab.
Yeah.
You're
I
welcome.
left it in there.
You're welcome.
You're welcome.
All right, so three, again, major things. We're going to talk about backgrounds, criteria for selection, and then the background characteristics and policymaking. Let's do background first.
All right, so typically in the Supreme Court, we see white males who have previously been lawyers. Not extremely diverse. The last 30 years or so, though, we've really expanded the diversity of the Supreme Court. There are currently 3 women serving, Hispanic, African American, etc. So historically, though, most of the Supreme Court justices have been older, in their 50s or 60s. Most, except for I think maybe 16 total, have been Protestant, upper middle class backgrounds, and again, most of the time they come from a lawyer profession or they have previously been a judge.
And remember that there's not any requirements to be a Supreme Court justice, so you're not, like, that's part of the reason why we do have, such quote-unquote diversity.
Mm-hmm.
We're seeing a lot more diversity now, though, as
Right.
Ms. Womack said, but it still does not reflect the population as a whole. Like, nobody's been, come from nothing story and rose all the way to the top.
Right. Most of the judges we see in the Supreme Court have already come a middle to upper class background.
True. Did you know that there was only one person to serve as president and Supreme Court justice?
Was it William Howard Taft?
It was.
Oh, is he the one who got stuck in the bathtub?
I've heard that before.
I think so.
Unfortunately. Anyway. All right, so this table is going to kind of just give you the current roster. Again, this is
a lie. This is not the current roster.
It's not the current roster. It's as of looks
January
like 2017. So you see, like, they have most of their previous positions were the Court of Appeals, so they were judges. Elena Kagan actually was not a judge; she was actually Solicitor General.
I didn't know that.
Which was she was a lawyer. She actually presented cases to the Supreme Court on behalf of the federal government. But that's it. I mean, so most of them are going to be judges, and since most of the cases they see are appeals cases, that actually would make a lot of sense for most of them to have appeals background. Yeah, they already have appeals background.
And so then the 2 that we need to add in here is Antonin Scalia died in 2016, so President Trump replaced him with Neil Gorsuch. And then Anthony Kennedy decided to retire this summer, and President Trump replaced him with Brett Kavanaugh.
And so you see, too, like, Anthony Kennedy was appointed by Reagan, and Kennedy, usually what they'll do is they'll wait until a conservative or a liberal president is around or in power so that they can be replaced by somebody who has similar beliefs to them. Kennedy was more towards the middle, though, wasn't he?
Yes.
Yeah, so Kennedy was kind of
we call him a swing vote.
Yes, he was a swing vote in the court, so he actually would pair a lot with some of the more liberal justices sometimes, and then just kind of flip-flop. People didn't really like that very much. They want him to be more
hardline.
There you go. Thank you.
Okay.
Go for it.
Sure.
You're doing great.
So criteria for selection. So when presidents think about these candidates who they think would be good to fill these open Supreme Court positions, they take a couple things into consideration. It used to be they would put emphasis on geography. Where has this particular judge, where are they from? Where have they been? If they were a lawyer, where were they practicing? Or if they were a judge, where were they judging before? We don't put as much emphasis on that anymore. They do look at religion, especially for some reason in the 70s and the 80s, we were focused on religion. And so prior to that, we had many, many Protestant judges. And now we've seen more Catholic, Jewish, etc., serving on the Supreme Court. And then the biggest factor is going to be that specific person's ideology or partisanship. Obviously, presidents want to choose justices who are going to align their political ideas with the president's. And that is a way for the president to kind of lock in their legacy. As we know, these judges serve for life. So these judges could potentially be making decisions for the next 40 years. And so we kind of say that the president's legacy is locked in with those years.
And that's a big reason why, like even the senators now are still fighting these huge battles over the Supreme Court, because they know that like, I mean, we have a more conservative court now than we've had since, I mean, the 1930s. So it's like the Republicans and conservatives are really excited about this, because they are, they're going to have control of the Supreme Court for, I mean, many years to come.
Yep.
And that's going to be a big problem for people who are more liberal leaning. So what's interesting about this is that you can choose the best candidate you want. They can have the same ideologies as you, the same religion. They're even from a nice geographic area. I don't know what that means.
Yeah.
But the reality is that as soon as they put on that Supreme Court justice robe, we have no idea how they're going to act. Anthony Kennedy is a great example of that. He was appointed by Reagan, who is a hardline conservative. Okay, he really wanted to go. He was talking about the moral majority. He wanted people to go back to simpler times, their Christian values, and then Anthony Kennedy did not. I mean, he supported like abortion rights and things like that were very against what Reagan's followers were in favor of him passing. So you expect certain things, and then you can sometimes get completely different things as well. Same thing with Nixon. I mean, Nixon was a conservative. He appointed conservative justices, and then all of a sudden, they are the ones that are getting rid of him, or helping, leading to his resignation,
forcing him to hand over Watergate tapes.
It's unfortunate.
So I think it was Eisenhower. And somebody had asked him at the end of his presidency, do you regret anything, or did you make any mistakes? And he said, yes, they are both on the Supreme Court. Because he appointed these two judges who he thought was going to side with him politically, and they didn't. They on all these decisions, they were opposite of what his political ideology was. And so that's kind of a famous quote. He said he made two mistakes and both were on the Supreme Court.
I love it.
Yeah.
Well, and that's the thing too. Like FDR was really liberal, but then he wanted to pass all these liberal policies to help end the Great Depression. But everybody before him had been Republican, and they had been appointing Republican justices for decades.
Yeah.
And now all of a sudden he's in there trying to change things, and they're like, "No, you can't do this. You can't do this." That's why a lot of the New Deal policies didn't work. So diversity is really, I mean, it's really not. I mean, again, yes, it's important, but at the same time, like we want, if you look at like. We want to have educated people in the Supreme Court, and unfortunately, it's really difficult for poorer people to get an education in America.
Right.
So we're looking that's why the diversity is a little bit lacking. But you want more, like more important than diversity is probably just having good people in there, wouldn't you say?
Yeah.
I mean, I hate to say that, but I mean that you want I don't want somebody to get appointed just because they are a minority. I would rather them be a good judge.
Yeah. And so that is kind of a point of debate between a lot of people. Do we want the Supreme Court to reflect the identity of the United States, where we are a very diverse population? Or, on the other hand, do we just need to decide we need to pick people who are really good for the job?
And that's a tough call. I mean, that's the thing. It's like I sound like a jerk when I say that.
I know.
And I don't want to like come off to you guys like you're like, man, Mr. Shaw's like
what a
super rude. But that's the thing is like if we
hard.
just start, it's kind of like the whole patronage thing. It's like, oh, okay, well you clearly you deserve this job because you meet X, X, and X.
Right.
Like if we start putting people in there that are not actually qualified, that becomes a big problem. That's when we're talking about the biggest court in all the land.
Right. But I think like President Obama did a good job at consciously trying to choose people who are more diverse, but who are also very qualified for the position.
Oh, I agree. And Clinton did the same thing.
Yes.
He focused a lot more on women, and that was like he was finding qualified people.
Ruth Bader Ginsburg, RBG.
She's a big fan.
Love her. All right,
okay,
let's move on.
Sorry,
we're taking too long.
All right.
Oh, okay.
Hey, we're done with
We're cool.
15.4. Into 15.5, we're going to outline the judicial process at the Supreme Court level and assess the major factors influencing decisions and their implementation.
All right.
Ooh. Here's your vocab. Write it. Love it.
Know it.
Okay. You
All
wanna
right,
go?
so a few
You
things
go.
we're going to run through. Courts as policymakers. So we're going to talk about the different criteria that goes into the Supreme Court actually accepting cases to hear, the process they go through when it comes to making decisions, why they make decisions, the basis of the decisions they make, and implementing court decisions. Who does that? What does it look like?
All right, so accepting cases. The first step in the process is what's really weird is you have to like make a judgment about what cases to judge.
Yeah.
So there's about 8,000 people, or there's about 8,000 cases that are asked. They ask the Supreme Court to review them every year, and they only look at about 80. So that's like
Seriously small number.
seriously small.
And it's not the justices themselves going through all 8,000 of these appeals. They have people, law clerks that work for them that are very good at their jobs. And they really filter through these cases, and they send these cases to the justices that they think they would most likely hear.
Correct. I mean, it would be impossible for these, 9 justices to work through all of these 8,000 cases because they're getting, huge briefs. Like
Right.
we're talking about briefs from
Pages
the
and
lawyers,
pages.
briefs from the amicus curiae briefs. Like it would be impossible for them to read through it all. So they all have great people who are working for them to make their jobs a lot easier. The justices actually meet once a week and they discuss potential cases. And you need at least 4 justices to accept a case in order for the whole Supreme Court to hear it. And that's called the writ of certiorari.
That's correct.
Nailed it. Okay.
Certiorari.
All right. So again, what happens then if 4 justices decide that they want to hear a case, they will issue a writ of certiorari, and that will basically bring the case up to the Supreme Court.
Correct.
Types of cases we're
Yes.
looking at. Again, they're like if it's only just like one person who's affected, the Supreme Court probably won't take it unless it's a really big deal about civil liberties or civil rights, like it says here. Anytime there's a discrepancy in the interpretation of a law, like so, for example, a justice or a judge in California and a judge in North Carolina, they are interpreting with the same law in 2 different ways. The Supreme Court is most likely to take that. And if the Solicitor General, who is again, it's like the number
Third
3,
in line.
number 3 person in the Justice Department, if they request the Supreme Court to look at a case on behalf of the United States, then they will also accept those most likely.
Good.
Okay.
All right, so this is a figure showing obtaining space on the Supreme Court's docket. So we know that the docket of the Supreme Court is like their calendar. And they themselves get to decide when they're going to hear a case, and they'll put that on the docket. So we see the flow. It's kind of a flow chart. It's going from federal courts and state courts. So that goes to requests for Supreme Court review. And remember, there's about 8,000 of those per year. At that point, then, the justices are going to discuss in their weekly conferences whether or not they think these cases should be heard. They will vote. If there are 4 votes, rule of 4, then they will place that case on the docket. And again, fewer than 100 cases a year, usually about 80 to 100, they will actually hear. And then if we go back to the middle, the appeals discussed in conference, 99% of the cases are denied.
True. You only take 80 out of 8,000. Quick
That's
math.
a lot.
That's only 1%.
Okay.
Write that down.
Write it down.
Okay, so the main thing that happens first is they're going to each of the lawyers from both the side of the plaintiff and the defendant, or the prosecutor and the defendant, they have to submit oral arguments, or they actually have to submit briefs. Then they get amicus curiae briefs as well, and then for the oral arguments, you only have 30 minutes. Okay, you have 30 minutes to state your case. The justices can ask questions.
They ask like hardline questions. They are like purposely ask these lawyers really difficult questions that they know the lawyers are gonna maybe have trouble answering, just for the purpose of doing it.
Right.
They just want to make sure the lawyer knows their stuff.
Right. And they don't have to. I mean, they can, like the book mentions, they can just like stare up at the ceiling if
Right.
they want, which seems rude.
Yeah.
But it's like you guys. You guys do that to us all the time.
All the time.
I guess it's not rude then.
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry.
Opinion writing. Okay, so every case we are going to see an opinion. Okay, so the Chief Justice will assign one of the associate justices to write the majority opinion.
If he's
if
not
he
in the not in the majority.
But will he write it if he is in the majority?
Yes.
Okay, so if he's not in the majority, the associate justices will write the majority opinion. So the majority opinion is the opinion or the decision that most of the justices agree on. In that opinion, they will explain their legal reasoning for their decision. We will also see sometimes concurring opinions, which is going to be, let's say 5 of the justices agree on one decision, but 2 of those five just say, we agree with the other 3, but for a different legal reason, they're going to issue a concurring opinion on that. And then there's also something called a dissenting opinion, which is, let's say again, that it was 5 that agreed and 4 that did not agree. The dissenting opinion are going to be those who disagree with the majority.
To be clear, these are like papers. They're actually like writing out papers, like with their opinions on them. And what's interesting too about the opinions is that sometimes like a dissenting opinion in one case can be used as a majority opinion in a later case.
Yes.
The most famous one is really Plessy versus Ferguson, where they are okaying segregation as long as the separate facilities are equal. There was one dissenting opinion in that case that was used later in Brown versus Board as the majority opinion, because again, like that's like obviously a big mess up by the Supreme Court. However, like at the same time, like they use it later to kind of reverse their own decision, and the Supreme Court's really the only one that can do that. They are like a really separate branch, and they kind of can keep themselves in check sometimes, and that's kind of what happened with Brown versus Board of Education.
Yep.
So this is the Supreme Court's decision-making process. So first of all, the case gets put on the docket, as Ms. Womack said. The briefs are submitted by both sides. The amicus curiae briefs are both filed. And these are also just huge papers like that they are submitting. It's part of the oral argument. Basically, it's a huge summary of everything that they want the justices to know. Then comes the actual oral argument itself. After that, the justices will conference. They will discuss the case. The Chief Justice will ask for a vote. If they don't know, they might actually just already know how they're going to vote, so they might not take a vote sometimes. And then opinion writing will be assigned. And actually, so if the Chief Justice isn't in the majority, he will assign the senior member that is in the majority to write that. They'll draft the opinions. They'll circulate them around themselves.
Yeah,
for
they can
comment.
all make comments on the different opinions.
Right, and what's interesting about like they have to make these are like super important for a lot, especially if it's like a groundbreaking case.
Yeah.
This is going to establish precedent for decades to come. So they want them to be as perfect or as close to perfect as possible.
And very specific.
Correct. And then after that, after the opinions are done, they've written those, then they're going to announce their decision in full court and then distribute those decisions to lawyers and courts all over America.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the basis of decision. So most cases we say the Supreme Court decides, it's called stare decisis, which translates to let the decision stand. And this means that in current Supreme Court cases, the justices are going to look at decisions that were made in previous Supreme Court cases and use those previous cases as precedent to decide on their current case. And so we say, let's say, sometimes we use the term breaking with precedent. For example, in Brown versus the Board of Education, they broke with precedent. Plessy versus Ferguson set the precedent that separate was equal. Brown versus the Board of Education overturns that precedent, so they broke with it. Okay, and why do justices disagree? Sometimes it's hard to determine previous court decisions. Sometimes they're not as specific as we would hope that they would be when writing their opinions or writing their decisions. And so the vagueness of their wording and of their decisions can come into play.
Well, and even the Constitution, too.
Absolutely.
What
The
heck does
Constitution
due
is not
process
just
mean?
straightforward. There are terms in there that are up for interpretation, and everyone interprets those things differently. And so that kind of jumps into judicial philosophy. There are some judges who believe that we should be interpreting the Constitution the exact way that the framers had written it. There are other justices who believe that we have changed as society. It's been over 200 years, and our ideas of liberty have changed, and therefore our decisions when it comes to these major court cases also have to adjust with the changing ideas of liberty. So judicial philosophy plays a big role in why justices will disagree. And then originalism is, I already kind of touched on that. That's the idea that the Constitution is interpreted the way that the framers had intended it.
Correct.
And so, again, some more conservative justices are going to stick more with that idea of originalism. And then other justices that are maybe more liberal are going to break away from that.
Correct. And I think that with originalism, there's two pathways you can take. There's original intent, where you believe that the Constitution should be interpreted in the original way that the founders intended it, as Ms. Womack said, or I can't think of the other one. It's original meaning, I think.
Yeah.
Original meaning,
I think that's right.
Which is really interesting because that they think that you should interpret it only using the exact words that are in the Constitution. So they're extremely strict, and it's not necessarily like that they are over. Yes, you're usually considered conservative, but they just think like, so. For example, if something's not in the Constitution, they're not going to believe that it is the federal government's job to deal with it. Right. That's the most often what happens.
If it's not in the Constitution, they don't feel like they have the power to even judge it.
Correct.
Or decide on it.
Exactly.
It's not a justiciable issue.
Nice use of vocab there.
Thank you.
One real quick note on stare decisis.
Steroids?
Stare
decisis.
Are you? Did I say it wrong?
That's
no,
right.
I don't know. Well, okay.
Stare decisis.
Okay.
Let the decision stand.
Anyway, it's really important in a democracy and in really any country that the law be predictable. Okay, and that is pretty much the idea behind stare decisis, is they want the law to be predictable from year to year. And that is why most of the cases are usually about continuing and continuity with the law, because people need to be able to predict the law from year to year, from decade to decade, and even 100 years to 100 years.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Anyway,
Thank you.
That's all. You're welcome.
You're welcome.
All right, so the most interesting part to me anyway, about the Supreme Court is that they are separate, but we have this thing called judicial implementation, and they have no power. Like, there's no part of them that is set aside to implement the decisions that they make. Okay, we know that the executive branch is in charge of implementing the Congress's laws. And at the same time, they're also in charge of implementing the court's decisions. So the court can decide something, but then they are entirely reliant on the executive branch to actually implement their decisions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So there's an interpreting population. Those are usually going to be the lawyers and the judges, even the president, theoretically. Well, the president kind of falls in a lot of these.
Yep.
But they are going to be the ones that actually interpret the court's decision. That's part of the reason why the Supreme Court tries to be so specific. They try to have no ambiguity at all in their decision. Unfortunately, that still does happen.
Yeah.
The implementing population is going to be the people in charge of actually making sure that these are being implemented, such as the president. He is going to be the main one at the top.
Bureaucracies.
The bureaucracies as well are going to be in charge of making sure that the court's decisions are followed. And I mean, Andrew Jackson had a really famous quote that he said, "Oh well, John Marshall decided this. Let's see him enforce it." And because again, it was his job to enforce it, but he didn't agree with it, so he didn't enforce it. So
right.
That's really the biggest problem. Like, even with I always go back to Brown v. Board. I talk about it.
It's a good one to jump
It's a good
off
one just
from.
because so like Eisenhower,
and everybody knows it.
Right. So they decided that schools shouldn't be segregated based on race, public schools anyway. And Eisenhower didn't necessarily enforce it right away.
No.
It took him sending in federal troops, into Arkansas like 3 or 4 years later, I think, to actually get their decision enforced. So we think of it as this, oh, great, segregation in public schools is over, but that actually, nothing happened.
Nope.
Took
many years.
Until he actually decided, hey, I guess I'll start enforcing
And
this.
then it was still almost 10 years after the decision when the rest of the country actually started to desegregate.
Correct. And that was actually when they started, like when they passed the Civil Rights Act
Right.
of 1965 or 1964, and then voting rights of 65. And then you see the Congress, which is already the most powerful branch. We didn't even really start following the decision of the court until Congress was like, hey, you should probably start doing this.
Right. And so that is what we mean by implementing population, that it's the judicial branch makes these decisions, but their hands are tied when it comes to actually enforcing them.
Correct. And then consumer population, these are the people that are going to be affected by this decision. Again, like in Brown v. Board, we're talking about, African-American students who wouldn't get a better education without going to white schools or
Right.
integrated schools anyway.
Right. And so they're saying these people who are affected by it, they also are charged with kind of implementing it, enforcing the issue, and saying we deserve to be in these other schools as these white kids are in. Right. And so they have to kind of push the issue as well.
Virginia, I think there was a school district in Virginia, they actually shut down their entire school district. They stopped funding a district because they didn't want to integrate. So for 4 years, there was just no school. Like they had to go to separate schools like around the area.
That's crazy.
Rather than integrate their population. Anyway, sad
Fun
really.
fact.
All right.
18.6.
Let's do it. We're going to trace the Supreme Court's use of judicial review in major policy battles in various eras of American history.
Era. Okay, these are vocab terms that we already know. We already know. Do we know Marbury versus Madison?
We covered it briefly.
Yeah, we did.
We'll go over it again today.
Yeah, and so it's just a very early court case that allows it basically establishes judicial review, which is the power of the Supreme Court to determine an act of Congress or the president unconstitutional.
What's funny is that they had already done that.
Right.
But it didn't actually get done until Marbury. Marbury v. Madison is given the credit, I guess.
Yeah, it kind of like hits the nail on the head.
Yeah.
At that point. Marbury v. Madison.
All right, so I guess because we're gonna talk about all these guys.
Yeah.
I'm just gonna skip it and we're gonna go to each one of them individually.
Okay.
So with Marbury v. Madison, again, do you think they need to know much of the background? We'll talk about the background in class.
Okay.
Okay, guys, we'll go over the background of Marbury
we gotta go
v.
over
Madison.
the case anyway.
Right. So this is your last thing that you need to know, the last court case you need to know for the semester, and it's also probably the most important. So
Agreed.
We will take time, make sure all you need to know for now is that it established judicial review, and it decided that the court has the power to interpret the Constitution and make sure that the executive and legislative branches are always in line with what the Constitution says. Okay, moving on.
Okay, so Mr. Shaw kind of pointed this out a little bit earlier in the lecture, but so FDR, right, he is the president during the Great Depression. Well, a lot of his policies, these New Deal policies, were seen as kind of liberal. It very much expanded the power of the federal government. And so their conservatives on the Supreme Court at the time did not believe that the federal government should be intervening in the economy. They thought the economy should be left alone and it would fix itself. And so a lot of these New Deal pieces of legislation were going to be struck down by the Supreme Court. So FDR says, let's try to pack the courts with these more liberal or progressive judges. And he actually asked, and I can't remember if it was a piece of legislation, but he asked to actually expand the number on the Supreme Court.
Yeah, so he started legislation that would allow him to add a new justice every time an old justice turned 70 and didn't retire. He would be able to add a new one, which would allow him, because there's nothing in the Constitution that says the number number of Supreme Court justices has fluctuated over time.
Yes, it has. And so anyway, he wants to expand the court because he wants more liberal judges in there to pass these policies. Congress refuses, and we say this quote. I've never heard this quote.
It's not very well known. Switch in time that
saved nine.
So basically what happened was that Congress refused. It actually made FDR look really bad. Like he was trying to become more of a monarch.
Dictator
kind
of a
exactly.
thing.
So there were two justices. I don't even know their names. You don't need to know them. They switched over and they started voting for New Deal policies. So it allowed more of FDR's liberal policies to stay in line with the Constitution because they started voting for him.
Right, and so which in turn saved the 9 justices. We kept the number at 9 on the Supreme Court. So switch in time that saved 9.
Correct. So the Warren Court is known as the most active court. You're talking. I mean, again, we've talked about so many of his decisions, and when I say his, we're talking about Earl Warren, like the court during his time.
Miranda v. Arizona, Gideon versus Wainwright. What was the school prayer one? Bethel v. Frazier?
No, that one was the inappropriateness.
Crap.
And
hold on, I got it. Anyway.
Engel v. Vitale.
Yes!
Got it.
Engel v. Vitale.
We'll learn about that next semester.
Yeah, anyway, it says no school prayer. No prayer in public school. Brown v. Board. Another one. Anyway, very active in this court.
So we see a lot of protections right now. Like we see civil rights protections, we see the rights of the accused protected.
Yes.
And it's really important that this huge expansion during this time. There were a lot of people that didn't agree with it. There was a lot of like mostly conservatives that thought that this was not the job of the court. That basically the court was usurping the power of the executive and the legislative branch by making all these sweeping decisions.
Mm-hmm. But if you look at the time period, it's right in the heart of the civil rights era, the civil rights movement. And so I think
Vietnam too.
And Vietnam. And so I think the court is actually reflecting the opinion of the public.
Sure.
In most of these cases, expanding these civil rights, because that's what was happening in the country at the time. Or at least there was a fight for that.
And you kind of see that like recently too, like with
Agreed.
like LGBTQ plus rights. Like a lot of Americans are in favor of expanding those rights, and that's kind of why you see in 2014, that they gave LGBTQ plus the right to marry,
right?
Or they at least protected it,
right? Okay, so then we move into
Burger. I could go for a burger right now.
So Richard Nixon, a conservative Republican, appoints Burger as Chief Justice. And he does this in hopes that he kind of swings. We're getting into the 70s and the 80s, and we start to kind of turn more conservative.
It's after all the hippies.
Right. And so he's trying to kind of swing the Supreme Court back to a more conservative court. And so he appoints this conservative Chief Justice. But under that, Mr. Burger, Chief Justice Burger, we actually see the legalization of abortion. We see expansion of affirmative action. Well, upholding an expansion of affirmative action. And then we also see, this is the Chief Justice that actually makes Nixon turn over these Watergate tapes. So Nixon and conservatives in general were not happy with the decisions. They thought definitely we would move more conservative, but that wasn't necessarily the case at this time.
Oh, bummer.
I know.
The Rehnquist and Roberts courts. So now we are actually into the conservative. We've gotten more conservative than we have seen from 1932 and beyond.
Yeah.
We are definitely more conservative than we have been in a while. First of all, we have Chief Justice William Rehnquist, which was appointed by Reagan, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's so many conservative appointees during this time. Mm-hmm. Chief Justice John Roberts, who he is currently the Chief Justice. He was appointed by George W. Bush. And then we see like really more conservative decisions, but nothing's been really overturned though. We haven't seen a whole lot of liberal decisions overturned. That's what a lot of people are worried about, like Roe v. Wade being overturned because that was done during a liberal court. Now we have a conservative one.
We definitely have a conservative court now with the two that Trump appointed.
Correct.
And so people are concerned that some of these more liberal decisions will be turned over now that we have a majority conservative Supreme Court. I guess we'll just have to see.
But we have seen a lot more conservative decisions in general. Again, like in Citizens United, it basically, which is a horrible court case. You're going to hate it. But they are basically, it is allowing people to spend as much money as they want on campaign contributions, which is definitely,
could be dangerous.
It could be dangerous.
Yeah.
More liberal justices are not in favor of that because they're trying to keep the money out of politics, so to speak. But who knows?
And then they highlight Bush v. Gore on here in 2000. So in the 2000 presidential election, it was obviously George Bush versus Al Gore, and it came down to the state of Florida, and the votes. It was a hot mess in Florida, and they actually ended up having to recount the votes in Florida, similar to what we've just seen in 2018 in the midterms. But the Supreme Court, it goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and they side with Bush, basically saying that we just didn't even have enough time to decide.
Correct. And I think Gore wanted a full recount.
He did. He wanted
of the entire election.
He did. And now it's important to note that Gore won the popular vote in the election, and so he had a leg to stand on with the recount, but there was no time. We have to swear in the president on January 20th, and it got to the point where it was just like, we don't even have time to do it. Bush wins.
Exactly.
Okay.
Last one. Let's do this. We're going to assess the role of unelected courts and the scope of judicial power in American democracy.
Perfect.
So this is the first, last section. Usually the last section just kind of wraps up. This one actually has some really important stuff, especially judicial restraint and activism. You absolutely need to know those. The other ones, maybe not so much, but I would still get them down just in case, because we're going to talk about them here. We've actually kind of talked about them already a little bit. Maybe not mentioning them by name.
All right, understanding the courts. We'll just talk about how the courts kind of correlate with democracy, and then the actual scope or span of the judicial power. So, how does the court system really fit into democracy? Some people argue that the way that we choose our judges or justices is not actually in line with democracy. They're not elected by the people. We know that they are appointed and approved by the president and then the Senate. And they're also very hard to remove. There's nothing in the Constitution that says a judge can be removed for X, Y, or Z. We can impeach Supreme Court justices, but it's pretty difficult to do.
It just says good behavior.
Yeah.
What does that even mean?
What is good behavior? That's a different interpretation for everybody. And then another thing is that judges, and Mr. Shaw kind of touched on this, judges are from usually elite backgrounds. And that is because, it is for people who are less privileged or less fortunate, it's difficult for them to get a really good education and a higher education and go to law school or whatever it might be. So a lot of these judges that are in the Supreme Court are already elite. They're not elected by the people. They're hard to remove. And so some people argue that that's kind of going against the idea of democracy.
Well, and it's just hard for the people to I can't, if I have a problem, I can't just go to the Supreme Court and be like, hey, will you guys see my case? You have to start a whole case. You have to start at the bottom, just like
Difficult
Drake.
process.
Oh, man, I made my Drake joke
I'm
finally.
sorry.
And you ruined it.
He started from the bottom, now he's here.
It's fine. Anyway, but what we're seeing is that it's really not as insulated as the framers thought it would be. They in Federalist 78, you guys read that Hamilton was like, it's not a big deal, guys. That they have these powers and they are appointed for life because we need them. We need them to be insulated from the public and not just bend to the whims. But we've actually seen that that's happened a lot more recently too.
Yeah.
That the court is actually reflecting public opinion, as Ms. Womack mentioned earlier.
Right. And then we got to talk about the scope of the power of the judicial branch. So are the courts too powerful? Some people would argue yes, some would argue no. We talked about judicial restraint. So that's going to be making those, deciding on a current case with how former cases were also decided. And that would be applying judicial restraint.
And you're not letting your own beliefs influence what you're deciding.
Exactly. And so defer to legislatures.
So what they're going to do is they're not they're going to say this is not the court's job to decide this.
That's right.
And they're going to allow whatever the legislature to do to actually take place.
So they're going to say whatever Congress made a law on this, and we're going to just let that stand. We're not necessarily going to overturn it or declare it unconstitutional. We're just going to let that lie.
Or let them deal with it eventually
right.
when they see fit.
So then we would move to judicial activism, and this is going to be making decisions that you kind of take your morality into play, and maybe you're making a sweeping judicial decision that's kind of overturning something that was made in the past.
Right. Like you're saying, I believe that, you could say something like, I believe in in protecting minority rights.
Right.
And like Congress, if Congress isn't doing it, like again with the case of the LGBTQ plus community,
Right.
like they did not have, there wasn't a federal law protecting gay marriage. So what they did is that the court said, there was an activist court, and they
Right.
said this needs to be protected. And
Yep.
their decision like basically made, like, well, I guess it doesn't, it still has to be enforced by the president, but their decision basically does protect the rights of LGBTQ plus to be married.
Yeah, and you can argue the same with Brown versus the board. It was definitely judicial activism. They said that our legislature, our Congress, is really not doing much about this. We have to take it in our own hands. We are going to decide this case, and then eventually it overturns whatever it might be.
Correct.
Okay.
Political questions, like again, they're going to talk. Like the problem is that we it's kind of like when you talk about justiciable decision. Like is the court able to decide this? And they try to not get as involved in politics because they're not supposed to be involved in politics.
Right.
They're not supposed to be Democrats and Republicans anymore. They probably still are. However, they're not supposed to let that influence their decision.
Right.
As much. Statutory constructions. Let's go back.
The judicial interpretation of an act of Congress, in some cases where statutory construction is an issue. Congress passes new legislation to clarify existing laws. Cool. So maybe the judicial branch decides a case, and then Congress goes back and says, maybe we need to clarify.
Sure. So, like, if a Supreme Court declares a congressional law unconstitutional, what Congress can do is they can just write a new law,
right?
And like they can clarify it. They can get around the areas that, because it's like usually the whole law is not going to be unconstitutional. It's going to be one minor part usually.
Well, can I give an example of this? So President Trump issues immigration bans right after he becomes president. Mm-hmm. And this is through executive order.
So
however,
exactly
right. However, the federal courts immediately said this is unconstitutional. And then the Trump administration goes back, rewords that immigration ban a little bit, and issues a new executive order clarifying things here and there. And then that one actually sticks.
Perfect. And I think that going back to the political questions, like what you're noticing is that if something is really like heated, really like a really politically charged issue,
right,
the court might not even get involved in it, because that, like, if whatever way they decide, it might be it's going to be the wrong one to maybe half of the population.
Right.
So they will try to avoid those sometimes, and that's why it's almost kind of frustrating that they don't. We want them to deal with these things. We want them to
make a final decision.
Make a final decision, but they won't, specifically because it is such a politically charged issue. All right, guys, we're all done. We hope you enjoyed this recording of the Shawsome Womack show. We'll try. We'll work on it. It's got to be better.
Womack.
The Womack. I like
Womack.
it. Okay, guys. We'll catch you next semester. All right. Take it easy.